Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Rowan Wilson, the Chief Judge of the New York State Court of Appeals, and on behalf of myself and my colleagues on the Court of Appeals, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our beautiful courtroom to learn about the architect who designed it, Henry Hobson Richardson. I'd like to also extend a special welcome to Mayor Kathy Sheehan for joining us, and also gratitude for hosting the reception in City Hall next door, which is also another Richardson building. I also want to thank the Historical Society of New York Courts for co-sponsoring this afternoon's event, as well as our distinguished panelists who are here to share with us their knowledge about Richardson, about this courtroom, and for what promises to be an illuminating presentation. It's also wonderful to see former judges of the Court of Appeals, Susan Reed and Leslie Stein here, Chief Administrative Judge of the New York Court System, Joe Zayas, and we will be joined, I believe, by Presiding Justice of the Appellate Division, 3rd Department. Shortly, she's on the bench, but is going to make her way here when arguments are done. An 1885 survey of American architects identified and ranked the 10 best designed buildings in the United States. 5 of those 10 were designed by H.H. Richardson. Trinity Church in Boston came in first. Albany City Hall took 7th place, and the New York Capitol took 9th. As many of you know, the New York Court of Appeals originally sat in the state capitol, and we moved to our present home here at 20 Eagle Street in 1917. This courtroom, designed by Richardson, was brought over from the Capitol, painstakingly disassembled and reassembled piece by piece. Whereas most courtrooms feature marble and stone, our courtroom is almost entirely wood. From the wood paneling, the intricately carved wood bench, the ceiling, the chairs, all of those features bring warmth to our courtroom. That, coupled with the placement of the bench so the judges are nearly at eye level with the advocates, conveys a message that the law can be delivered with warmth, not coldness. The law is carefully carved into a malleable substance itself, renewed and regrown, and that justice need not be delivered from on high, but at eye level. The portraits that line the walls are perhaps the courtroom's most impressive and unusual feature. 85 portraits line the walls today. There were, of course, fewer in Richardson's time. Many of these judges had not yet served when he designed the courtroom. But the design choice to include the portraits conveys an important message about justice. The room does not feature one portrait, but an overwhelming number, and their inclusion links past and present. Perhaps, as Richardson intended, working beneath the watchful eyes of our predecessors reminds us that every decision this court issues is part of a lineage, every word weighed against generations of judgment and integrity, that we are but temporary stewards of our state's great common law tradition, and that it takes many hands, minds, and hearts to carry forward our great mission. In short, the carefully considered majesty of this room reflects the nature of our calling. It is through this room that the public may feel confident that our court, and by extension, the courts whose judgments we review, are committed to delivering equal justice under the law. Although I never before have presumed to speak for my colleagues without getting their permission first, I feel safe stating that each of us feels privileged beyond measure to serve as caretakers of the Richardson courtroom and the law that has been so lovingly tended within its walls for the past 178 years. Once again, welcome. I'm glad to see you all here. I now invite my friend Hank Greenberg to introduce today's panelists.
Good afternoon and welcome to this wonderful moment in the cultural life of the city of Albany. On behalf of the Historical Society of the Courts of the State of New York, I want to thank Chief Judge Wilson for his leadership of the greatest court system in America, and also for the first time in a decade, opening up Court of Appeals Hall, not just to lawyers during oral argument, but to the entire city of Albany in the capital region. I also want to thank your superb staff, your clerk, Heather Davis, her indefatigable colleague, Ann Byer, for helping to make this afternoon possible. Allison Morey, the Executive Director of the Historical Society, thank you for all of your work. Special thanks to Paul Grondel, who is the Executive Director of one of the jewels of the Capital Region, the Writers Institute of New York. I also see Senator Pat Fahey, who is an enormous supporter of culture and the arts in this community. Thank you to one and all. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight in such large numbers. I have the privilege of introducing the three people, the three internationally recognized and respected experts of H.H. Richardson. And I think a good place to start in making that introduction is by taking you back to the moments when this courtroom first opened on January 14, 1883 in the Capitol, before it was moved, as the Chief Judge said, in 1917. And a few months before the opening day of oral argument, the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, John Duke Coleridge, who was touring parts of the United States, was given a tour of the courtroom. And he said upon laying eyes on this magnificent temple of justice, "It is," and I quote, "the most beautiful courtroom in the world." And indeed it is. But I think an even better description of it was given by former Court of Appeals Judge Susan Reed about 20 years ago, when she said it is, quote, "ineffably beautiful, no, perfect." It is perfect. And the genius who designed this perfect courtroom, Henry Hobson Richardson, his life and his works are the reason why we are here to learn about him. And the three people to my right do us great honor by sharing their expertise about Richardson. Starting to my immediate right, Jay Wickersham, that may be a name familiar to the lawyers in the room, Wickersham, a great law firm in New York. He is a lawyer and also an architect, a founding partner of the law firm Noble, Wickersham and Hart in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For 15 years, he taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he was a professor in practice. Mr. Wickersham is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School. To his immediate right is Chris Milford, a distinguished architect and partner in the architectural firm Milford and Ford Associates, where he specializes in historic preservation and restoration. He, along with Mr. Wickersham, have co-authored multiple articles on H.H. Richardson's work and was instrumental in preserving 5 Richardson buildings in Massachusetts. He received his undergraduate and graduate degree in architecture from Cornell University. And to the far right is Hope Mayo, a renowned expert in rare books, drawings, prints, and manuscripts. And for present purposes, most importantly, she was the Philip Hofer Curator of Printing and Graphic Arts at Harvard's Houghton Rare Book Library, where she oversaw the Richardson drawing collection. She received her PhD from Harvard University, her master's degree in library science from the University of Chicago, and studied at the University of Munich. Most recently, our 3 speakers collaborated on the publication of a landmark book about Richardson, already an award-winning book, Henry Hobson Richardson, Drawings from the Collection of Houghton Library, Harvard University. The book not only makes extraordinary contributions to the history of architecture in America, it does so by drawing together a trove of over 4,000 sketchings by Richardson, many of which never previously seen, some of which surround the courtroom and the entrance to the courtroom, copies of those drawings. So I'm now pleased to turn over to the podium Mr. Wickersham.
We are so thrilled to be here today. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Great. Judge Wilson and all of the judges of the court, this is sort of an extraordinary event, and I have to say, when I was a first semester law student reading Judge Cardozo's opinions on foreseeable harm in tort class, it never occurred to me that one day I would actually be making a presentation in front of the Cardozo bench on architecture. So I never could have imagined that confluence. But I won't, Hank mentioned all of the people and all the organizations who have just been such wonderful hosts to us. And, I have to say that it's a little humbling to be here in Albany, to have had this chance. We've spent all day, immersed in the state capitol, in the city hall, and now in this, extraordinary environment that, in a way, you all know more than we do about the physical buildings themselves and have, stewarded them, over generations. So, what I think, we really hope to bring today is, by talking about the drawings that Richardson and his studio made, to give a better sense of how these buildings came into being, and the process of design and collaboration that gave rise to them. The Richardson Drawings Collection is one of the great unknown treasures of American architecture. It's over 4,000 drawings in the Houghton Book Library at Harvard. And up until the publication of this book, this collection had been largely unknown, partly because of the size of the collection and also because of the immense fragility of the drawings themselves. And so it really was a remarkable and a wonderful experience for the three of us to get to spend 5 years in Houghton Library, to look at every single one of those drawings, and then to be able to make a selection of 450 of them and really bring them to the public, and bring them to the public in a way that shows not just the end results, the buildings themselves, but the process of architectural design and how it is an intensely collaborative process. And the Richardson Drawings Collection really underscores that. So in this presentation, there are 3 things we want to emphasize. First, just give a quick overview of Richardson's life and career to put the drawings and the buildings in context. Then to talk a little bit about the drawings themselves, what kinds of drawings there are, who made them, and then to bring us here to Albany and to talk about the stories that they can tell us about how these buildings came into existence. Richardson is often thought of as the quintessential Boston architect. He went to Harvard. His house and his studio were in the Boston suburb of Brookline, and the greatest concentration of his buildings are in the Boston area. But in fact, he was a Southerner. He was born and raised in Louisiana, mostly in New Orleans, and he first came north in 1856 as a Harvard undergraduate. He wasn't a very serious student, but he was gregarious. He made wonderful friends there, some of whom became lifelong friends and clients, and particularly among them, the future historian Henry Adams, who became one of his closest friends and would ultimately become a client in Washington, D.C. And at Harvard, he conceived the idea, the ambition of becoming an architect. There were no architecture schools in the United States at the time, so he convinced his family to send him to Paris, where he could study at the École des Beaux-Arts, the leading architecture school in the world. This is an example of the kind of drawing he would have learned to make in Paris. This is for an unbuilt hospital design early in his career, but this kind of design, what is known as a partie, how to take the complexity of a large building with many different functional needs, how to organize it in a clear, logical way, fitting into the site, and in a way that would then provide a framework upon which the further development of the design could be built. All of that was what he learned as a student at the École. While he was in Paris, the Civil War broke out. He was cut off from his family, no longer had any money, and so he took a job part-time with the office of a government architect in Paris. And so by the time he came back to the United States in 1865, he had both the best academic training and the best professional training of any American architect of his generation. He never went back to the South. He came straight to New York, where he set up an office, started building a practice there, started getting commissions. And in his early work, you can actually see the other stream that contributed to his individual genius. Alongside the Beaux-Arts classicism he had learned in Paris, he was paying very close attention to what was going on in Great Britain. He was studying the Gothic revival architecture there. He traveled in Britain with Henry Adams. He subscribed to British architectural journals. And so in this building, an early courthouse design that still stands in Springfield, Massachusetts, you can see this feeling for the powerful three-dimensional massing, the sculpture of a building in space, and for the attention to materials and texture that really was the hallmark of the British Gothic revival, and that he would bring together with the clarity and order of French classicism. The other important thing that happened early in his career in New York was that he met a neighbor on Staten Island, the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. The two of them became friends immediately. Olmsted was about 10 years older, so he was something of a mentor to Richardson professionally. But very soon they formed not just a friendship, but an artistic collaboration. And I'll just read here what Olmsted said about Richardson after his death. Olmsted said of Richardson, "He would take such an eager, unselfish, and really vital interest in one's aims and schemes, be so intensely and intelligently sympathetic, that he was the greatest comfort and the most potent stimulus that has ever come into my artistic life." And so, I think that, praise from one of the great artistic geniuses of 19th century America, of another, kind of shows both Richardson's abilities, but also, I think, starts to give you a sense of his equal talent for collaboration. In 1872, Richardson's life was transformed when he won the National Design Competition for Trinity Church on Copley Square in Boston. At the age of 33, he was immediately thrust into the forefront of the American architectural profession. The design of Trinity Church actually took about 5 years, and so it really became the building that not only made his reputation, but allowed him to develop his mature style. So you see here in the top left-hand corner, the partie, the quick initial sketch he made of how to organize the church, connected to a parish house by a cloister, and how to set that in a way that made sense on this oddly shaped trapezoidal site. Underneath it is one of the competition drawings, this one prepared by the first of a series of brilliant young assistants. This was by Charles McKim. And here on the right is how that tower was ultimately transformed 4 years later in this drawing by Stanford White. And you can see here what becomes a hallmark of Richardson's ability to keep reworking the design to make it simpler, calmer, more powerful. And that we will see here in the work in Albany as well. Richardson saw that his future was in Boston. He moved first his family and then his studio to Brookline, Massachusetts. And over the upcoming years, a flood of designs came out. He was interested in all the opportunities that an American architect in the boom of post-Civil War America was able to take on. He was never a snob. He said he would design anything from a cathedral to a chicken coop. And so his buildings ranged from great civic buildings like the Allegheny County Courthouse here in Pittsburgh that still stands, to really the invention of the informal shingle-style house of the American suburb and the seaside. This is the Stoughton House, which you can see on Brattle Street in Cambridge. And then he showed in the Marshall Field wholesale store in Chicago, sadly demolished in 1930, showed to Louis Sullivan and his Chicago contemporaries that the ordinary commercial office building could become a work of art. And in that really laid the foundations for the modern American skyscraper. You've already heard from Judge Wilson how highly he was esteemed in the profession. 5 of the 10 most beautiful buildings in America were chosen as his by the members of the American Institute of Architects, including the Capitol and the Albany City Hall. A year after that poll, he was dead. He died at age 47, at the height of his career. He had been sick a long time. He suffered from an untreatable kidney disease. There were many other infections, and there were times when he would be in bed for weeks at a time, and the young assistants in his studio would have to bring the drawings upstairs, pin them to the cork walls of his bedroom so that he could do critiques from bed. But nevertheless, his death was sudden, it was a shock, and we owe a great debt to the 3 young assistants in his office, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. 2 of them in their 20s, Rutan only 35. The 3 of them took on the practice. They completed all of the buildings that were under construction in his name and paid the fees to his widow, who had been left destitute. Richardson made a lot of money, but he spent it all. And then they continued on with an architectural practice that endures today under the name Shepley Bulfinch. And in that practice, they saved the drawings collection, kept them in their offices up until 1942. And then in that year, when Harvard had built the Houghton Book Library, there was a new state-of-the-art place where the drawings could be safely guarded. They were given to Harvard, where they have been ever since. So now I'll say a few words about the drawings themselves. They range widely in size. This is a competition drawing for the Albany Cathedral. You can see the size of it. It had to be wheeled around on a cart. Here you see Hope and me looking at pricing drawings for Trinity Church in Boston, also very large, filled with dimensions and notes. We worked all through the pandemic. Sometimes the library was closed and we had to work remotely. And I will say Richardson's drawings kept us sane through the pandemic. But then many of the drawings are like this. This is a sheet of studies of the clock tower for the Albany City Hall. Some of these, as you can see, are just scraps of tracing paper 2 or 3 inches square. And so it's that range of drawings that very quickly got us so excited about the opportunity to show the evolution of a design. Now, there were a lot of challenges. Almost none of the drawings in Richardson's collection are dated, and almost none of them are signed or even initialed. And so we had to really look at the drawings themselves. They'd been very roughly cataloged by project, but not beyond that. So we had to really study the drawings, figure out what was the sequence of design, what would seem to be the earliest ones, how it had developed. And then also we were deeply interested in who may have been the talented young assistants who worked on the various projects and who each gave their own special flavor to the design. Whenever possible, of course, we would want to start with Richardson's own drawings. And in the first 10 years of his practice, he kept these in this bound notebook. Here is a typical 2-page spread from the notebook. He's sketching ideas for the floor plan for an important house in Newport for a banker called Watts Sherman. Often scribbling figures, as he is here, where he's doing quantity takeoffs, trying to figure out how many square feet or cubic feet of material is it, multiplying that, are they somewhere remotely close to the client's budget? But then, scrawled across this sheet on the diagonal is one of these great aha moments. At this point, he had been struggling with that central tower of Trinity Church for over 2 years. He was unhappy with the design, and the engineers kept saying it was too heavy, the foundations wouldn't support it. And so here in the middle of thinking about a house design, he suddenly figures out how to do that central tower. He does this sketch, hands it to his assistant, Stanford White, who then creates that drawing that I showed you before, and from that comes the church as it exists today. Later in his career, Richardson would just grab any scrap of paper that came to hand. He had blue stationery with his name embossed on it, and so often he would draw on that. He would draw with a kind of a soft pencil, as in this plan for an unbuilt house in Boston's Back Bay. And then as the house started to take shape, as the plan started to take shape, he would trace over that in ink to kind of give the design more clarity. Here he's thinking about the library at the University of Vermont in Burlington. And you can see him simultaneously thinking with the floor plan on the left, then two different ways in which two-dimensionally the front of the building might appear. And then on the right, he's now starting to think three-dimensionally. How will this appear as a sculptural mass in space? And then I think this is one of our favorite drawings in the collection. This is for the rectory of Trinity Church in Boston's Back Bay. The assistant on this was Langford Warren, who also, as I'll say later, was the assistant on the Albany City Hall. So Warren would have drawn that very handsome elevation at the top, the floor plan on the bottom, but then all over this sheet of paper are notes, scribbles in two different hands, some by Warren and some by Richardson himself. And what's clearly happening here is the two of them are sitting over the drafting table, the drawing is between them, and their pencils are talking to each other as they're talking to each other, thinking about the design, sometimes how high should the floor heights be, then looking at how they might shape a space for cozy sitting around a fireplace, how they might deal with a detail of the roof edge. So in this one sheet of paper, that entire wonderful collaborative design process within Richardson's studio is captured on paper. So now I'll say a few words about that studio. It was attached to his house in Brookline, and there's a number of photographs we have of him kind of surrounded by his assistants. Here they pose for a somewhat jocular group photograph, and I will note that the drawings at the back of the room there are his competition drawings for the All Saints Cathedral here in Albany. He lost the competition, but he was very proud of that design and kept them pinned up on the wall of his studio. This is a drawing by the first of his series of great assistants. This is by Charles McKim, who also had gone to the École des Beaux-Arts, and this is one of the competition drawings for Trinity Church. And you can see the mastery that McKim has in both the draftsmanship, but also in the watercolor, in conveying the play of light and shadow that gives the three-dimensional sense of the space, as well as the idea of this being a richly colored space, which if you've been to Trinity Church, you will know ultimately was developed by John Lafarge with a wonderful set of painted decorations. When McKim left the office, his place as chief design assistant was taken by Stanford White, who made enormous contributions here in Albany. White came to Richardson's office when he was only 16. His entire architectural education was as an apprentice for 8 years in the office. He admired Richardson greatly. He called him the great mogul. And he had a wonderful flair both for materials, for color, and for clarity of shape and space. This is the Watt Sherman House in Newport, which is really one of the transformational houses in the history of American residential architecture. When White went to join McKim and form McKim, Mead and White, Langford Warren joined the office. And you can see here, again, a wonderful feeling for color, for texture. He had been trained under a Gothic Revival architect in England and brought a wonderful flair that way. This is a collaborative drawing, a project that Warren worked on, but where the design is very much a collaboration between Richardson's studio and Olmsted's. It's called the Oaks Ames Memorial Hall in northeastern Massachusetts, and you can just see here how the architecture, this wonderful romantic castle-like structure, is growing out of the rocks, where Olmsted had them actually dig the dirt away so that the rock ledges would become that much more dramatic. And then Olmsted designed a wonderful stair that crawls up over those ledges like a snake. So, in this drawing, which exists in two copies, one in the Richardson archive, one in the Olmsted archive, that collaboration is put on paper. Another person who may in fact have been the chief designer on this space that we are in was Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow. He was a nephew of the famous poet. He thought very highly of himself, and he wrote a lot of snarky letters to his mother about what was happening in the studio and who got which project and how he was disappointed that he didn't get to work on certain ones, which was quite helpful to us in figuring out how the office worked. This is a wonderful house in Waltham, Massachusetts that he worked on. And finally, Charles Coolidge, who was one of the people who carried on the Richardson practice and completing the buildings, including the state capitol. He had a wonderful artistic hand, and this is for a library in Malden, Massachusetts. There also were members of the studio who had other kinds of artistic skills. Francis Bacon was particularly known for making renderings, and this extraordinary bird's eye view of the courthouse in Pittsburgh, gives a sense of his skills. Bacon also had a real expertise towards furniture design, and it is very possible that he was the person who designed the furniture in this courtroom and the ornament on the Cardozo bench as well. Again, we don't have firm documentation, but his role in the studio and similarity in other work, leads us to suggest that. So now let's turn to Albany, or actually on our way to Albany, we'll begin 300 miles to the west in Buffalo. Because the story of Richardson's involvement here really begins with the collaboration between Olmsted here on the left and William Dorsheimer on the right. Dorsheimer, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was a up-and-coming lawyer and politician in Buffalo, very interested in civic matters, and in the late 1860s he invited Olmsted to come to Buffalo to start to develop what would become Olmsted's first opportunity to do a citywide park system and a system of parkways linking those open spaces. Really his first chance to work at that kind of scale. While Olmsted was working on the park system, a major commission came up to design a new mental asylum in Buffalo. 11 buildings on a 200-acre site, and so Dorsheimer was able to steer that commission to Richardson and Olmsted. And so this was their first opportunity to collaborate, and it was also Richardson's first opportunity, even before the Capitol here in Albany, to design a major public building. So here's a sheet from his sketchbook showing his initial thoughts about different ways to organize this 11-building campus with a central administration building, a series of male and female wards. He and Olmsted ultimately developed the site plan together. They canted the orientation so that the best sunlight would come into the wards. The entire site was a therapeutic environment with open spaces for ball games and then with kitchen gardens behind the buildings where the patients could work as part of their therapy. And then the buildings themselves, although they may, I think to our eye, have a rather severe look, in fact, on the interior, they are very light-filled. There are generous spaces. They're generally two patient rooms with wide areas for them to socialize. And I think as a sign of the success of these buildings, in fact, some of you may know the central building has been recently converted into a hotel. Chris and I saw it before it had been reused, but it is apparently very successful that way, and we're hoping that other buildings, most of the campus has survived, will find new uses. So that now brings us to Albany. Dorsheimer had switched parties. He had been a Republican. He'd actually been the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of New York, but he was increasingly disenchanted with the Grant administration. He allied himself with the Democrats in 1872, and in 1874 he was on the statewide ticket with Samuel Tilden. Tilden was elected governor, and Dorsheimer was his lieutenant governor. And Tilden asked him to sort out the mess that the state capitol building project had become. This is the design as it existed by Thomas Fuller, the Canadian architect best known today for the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. Fuller's design at this point was massively underfunded, and by 1875, 8 years into the project, all that you could see was the basement walls just starting to come up out of the ground. So Dorsheimer turned to Richardson and Olmsted. They also brought in a third architect, a very respected senior architect from New York called Leopold Eidlitz, for the three of them to do a peer review of what was going on. They concluded that the construction quality was good enough. They didn't have to tear it all out, but that the floor plans were massively inefficient. The exterior was much too fussy. And so they then went beyond the critique and rather immodestly offered their own design. And so here we see the exterior of the design that they submitted along with their report. The goal was to have something that was far less fussy, something that was calmer, more dignified, and also more buildable. They had a rather interesting challenge because the bottom was in this ornate classical style. Both Eidlitz and Richardson favored medieval revival. But they were looking at ways that the design could slowly transform itself, become less complicated as you moved upwards. Dorsheimer loved the design. He let Fuller go, and he appointed Eidlitz and Richardson as the new architects of the state capitol, with Olmsted consulting to them as a landscape architect, and also with his great knowledge of construction projects, having run the construction of Central Park in New York. One would have thought that this would have met with a great approval. Instead, there was an enormous outcry by the American Institute of Architects in New York City, led by the dean of the profession, Richard Morris Hunt. They published public letters. They said that this was an abomination to combine medieval architecture with classical architecture in this manner. And they even went so far as to get the state legislature to pass a statute saying that the state capitol must be in the Italian Renaissance style. Dorsheimer was very cool. He told the architects not to respond, just keep your heads down and keep working. And so they came up with a slightly modified design. Essentially what they did was they took their design and they threw a few columns at it. This has nothing to do with the Italian Renaissance. This is the French Renaissance style of the early 15th century. But they all agreed, they all concluded correctly that no one in the legislature would know the difference between the Italian Renaissance and the French Renaissance. And so they kept going. The exterior, the overall forms of the exterior may have been a little more the hand of Eidlitz, but it seems to have been a collaboration, and certainly in this latter design, the Harvard collection has some wonderful drawings, and these are most likely from the hand of Stanford White. So here you see a sketch of the east front, of the top, and these kinds of wonderfully kind of dramatic profiles of the corner towers, the dormer windows. And then when you come around to the west front, here are two alternative designs that White did. I mean, imagine having someone in your office who could dash off a watercolor sketch with this kind of verve and precision. And the one on the left is a little closer to the east front. The one on the right is actually what was ultimately built. And so you can see from here, and I think this photograph shows well, even with this modified design, how the design simplifies itself as it moves upward. And so it really does achieve the greater calm and dignity that Richardson and Eidlitz were aiming for. The project went on for many years. It was actually from 1875 to 1898. And so here's a marvelous drawing in the Harvard collection. Clearly one of the draftsmen from Richardson's office had come to Albany, and rather than doing a sketch about how they should do the flashing over a window, which was probably what he should have been doing, he was much more interested in sketching what was going on site. And so this is this whole apparatus of wooden scaffolding that would have filled up that central courtyard, the hoisting mechanisms. You can see men up on the roof putting the slate tiles in place. So I think from this sketch you really get a sense of what a beehive of activity the Capitol was for many years and decades. The interior, as you probably know, was divided up between Richardson and Eidlitz. The red line shows the rough division line. So Eidlitz did the north wing, which holds the assembly chamber, and he also did the two main stairs, the assembly chair and the Senate chair, at the corners of the east wing, which he also did. Richardson was responsible for the south wing with the Senate chamber and for the west wing with the great western stair in it. And over time, two major projects that had originally been part of Eidlitz's scope got given to Richardson. One was the Court of Appeals, which would originally have been in the north wing underneath the assembly chamber. Richardson was going to do one room, Eidlitz another. They ultimately gave that to Richardson in the southeast corner. And then the State Library was ultimately moved to the west wing. So Richardson actually really got the majority of the major spaces in the building. The first to be completed by Richardson's studio and the most richly documented is the Senate chamber. And this was one of the last projects that Stanford White worked on in the studio. And here's this marvelous watercolor view. We were just in there today, and to be able to say that that sense of form and color, absolutely comes through in the room as it has been so beautifully restored. And you see here in this watercolor, it's not just the overall form, but all of that richness of detail as you come in close. Here's a two-dimensional view of one of the side elevations. And again, some of the decorative program. Well, not all of it, of course, was built, but a great deal of it was installed. And again, characteristic of Stanford White that he would come up with a little bit of gold leaf to dash on the watercolor paper here to give it a little extra punch. But the precision that you kind of see in Richardson's work, required looking at every corner of the building. So this is a corner of the Senate chamber where they're looking in detail, this draftsman, at the moldings. How are they going to fit together? What's the material? What's going to be marble? What's limestone? Where will there be some mosaic? That kind of detail went into every element of the building, as it did into the furniture. Richardson always tried to control the total environment down to the furniture, the light fixtures, and so we have some wonderful drawings here of chairs and desks in the Senate chamber, and that of course it's an earlier study, not quite, I think, as it was built, but kind of shows a resemblance to what you see in the Senate chamber today. So now that brings us now to this room. We don't, I'm sorry to say, have quite that richness. We don't have the overall kinds of drawings that were made for the Senate chamber. But I think we do have a sense, when we put this room in context with some of the other drawings. And in particular, when we look at the wall on the left-hand view in this one, or the wall right here too, the relationship of the fireplace, that great broad fireplace with that graceful curve, and then that very abstracted grid of the wooden panels is very similar to a drawing that I will show you of the State Library made by Alexander Wadsworth Longfellow. And so that's why we think that Longfellow may well have been the design assistant who really worked on this project. What we do have are wonderful details, and again, examples of how Richardson's studio looked at every detail, but also thought about it in a collaborative way. So here's a sketch of the figures from the state seal as they would ultimately be carved over the fireplace. So they're sketching it out, but then this sketch would have been given to the wood carvers, and they trusted the carvers to add their own individuality to these details. Here, again, when afterwards, invite everyone to go up and take a look at the fireplace. This is the iron backing of the fireplace, and there is an ornamental pattern that was designed in this drawing and is almost exactly what you will see there, which also means this room was so well loved, they actually took the back of the fireplace out and brought it over to this building. So that gives you a further example. And then, of course, here is the wonderful grandfather clock. Again, you'll note, it obviously went through a little bit of evolution. This sketch shows one clock face where here there are two, but in all other respects, it has taken its form in this wonderful sketch. And I think, again, that sketch gives you that sense in its, not just the precision of the drawing, but also the feeling of material, the tactile feeling that's in this drawing. So many of these drawings are really invitations to the craftsman who would then carry them out. You all, of course, know the great staircase. There are a great many drawings of the staircase, as you can imagine, because the complexity of the spatial elements and then the organization and the building of it. Richardson's studio did all their own engineering. So they had to figure out not only how the staircase was going to fit together, but how all the vaults would work, how it would all hold together, without collapsing. And then moving from that into the detail, this was an earlier version of the glass skylight, a little different from what you see today. But then they wanted to also convey this to non-architects. This is a drawing they made that was published in a British architecture magazine, where it's as if you had actually cut open the building. It's as if you were peering inside the building, as if you were peering inside an architect's model to be able to perceive the three-dimensional complexity of this extraordinary stair. But then also as a reminder that, for Richardson, these spaces were not abstract, these were meant to be inhabited. So here you see how people would be moving up and down, how they'd be experiencing a stair. Here's a messenger running upstairs with an urgent message. And then here are sketches where they were studying various elements. What on the lower left, an idea for the lighting fixtures, which might have actually been the carved figure of some Greek goddess before it took its ultimate form. Or on the right, they loved the idea of getting some animals in there, and there are various sketches of lions. And so, of course, you're familiar with the stair. The program of the carved figures was not part of Richardson's. That was really carried out by Perry, who ultimately completed the building. But Richardson's studio certainly wanted a richness of carved ornament, as you see here. And then the last space in the state capitol to talk about was the original state library, and that was on the third and fourth floors at the top of the western stair. This is, as I said, a drawing by Longfellow of the interior of the library, and that I think really is why we think that there is a real family resemblance between that and what we see here in this room. The library, as it was ultimately built, had a more monumental form here, perhaps by Charles Coolidge. And so this is the original library, a two-story space, which of course was destroyed in the fire in 1911 and has since been built over in it's still a very handsome space, but not with this kind of grandeur. So just close with two other projects. First, the one that got away, the All Saints Cathedral. Richardson invested a lot of energy into this, and we have his initial sketches. Here he's drawing a little partie of something as grand as the great cathedrals of 13th century France. And on the right, there's his initial sketch of what would have been the western entrance front with the great rose window. And here are the competition drawings. It would have just been an extraordinary structure, envisioned at that time to be on an open site, not hemmed in as it is today. And here in this cutaway section, you can imagine with the great rose window how that would have glowed within the space. But at the same time he put all this energy into it, he also knew he was taking a risk. He knew that Bishop Doane really liked Gothic architecture, the pointed arch of the Gothic over the round arch of the Romanesque that he favored. But nevertheless, he did a Romanesque style, and he came in second in a two-person competition. A local architect named Gibson was given the commission. The design you see today is Gibson's design, and so Richardson's design lives only in these drawings. But he did win another competition, and of course we know the wonderful results there, one of the most hailed buildings in America. So this is a competition drawing of the City Hall, where these and it was built, as you can see, almost exactly as the competition drawings showed. But here too, we have his initial sketches on his blue stationery. So the top drawing is his sketch of the floor plan, but that underneath that shows he was very much thinking about the context. And so he wasn't sketching the building from the front, from the Capitol side. He was thinking about how it would sit on the hillside, how it would be climbing up, and that series of towers and roofs that builds up to the great climax of the bell tower at the corner is already kind of nascent in that first sketch of his. I'd mentioned that Langford Warren was the design assistant. He had a particular kind of feeling for this sort of three-dimensional flair. This is a study by Warren. And then here's a series of studies of the bell tower and of the entrance arcade. And then here are the structural drawings that were given to the contractor. So again, Richardson in his office had to do all of the engineering for those massive foundations that would support the bell tower, which on this drawing is really quite graphically beautiful. It almost looks like a rocket ship blasting off into space. And then we'll sort of close here. This is at the back corner of the building, and this is the lawyer's staircase. If you had made an argument in the courtroom there, you would come down and you will see here the draftsman. This is a construction drawing. It's filled with dimensions. They were working out exactly how the staircase would fit, but the draftsman couldn't resist putting the lawyer in, putting his top hat on just before he steps out into the street. And so I'll just close here with, I'll come back to Olmsted again. This is that drawing we showed you of the collaboration between Richardson and Langford Warren. And here is what Olmsted said about Richardson's attitude towards drawings. He said that for Richardson, an architect's most valuable appliances were tracing paper and India rubber. Nothing like tracing over tracing 100 times. There was no virtue in an architect more to be cultivated and cherished than a willing spirit to waste drawings. Never, never, till the thing was in stone beyond recovery, should the least indisposition be indulged to review, reconsider, and revise every particle of his work, to throw away his most enjoyed drawing the moment he felt it in him to better the design. And so I think that's really, for us, the fascination and the paradox. For Richardson, these drawings were means to an end, what architects even today call instruments of service. And yet, as I hope you'll agree, so many of them are just beautiful aesthetic objects in themselves, and they are just invaluable as evidence of this collaborative process of design. How great architecture does not come as a single thought of genius. It is a slow, collaborative evolution, and that's what we have around us in this room, what we have all around us here in Albany, and it's been a great privilege to be able to speak in this room to all of you about Richardson and his drawings. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. That was magnificent. I think we have time for two questions, one for each of your colleagues and collaborationists in this critically important book. Perhaps I could begin with Ms. Mayo. You lived with Richardson's sketches for many years as the curator at the Houghton Library.
Yes.
Could you just sort of tell us how Harvard came to possess the sketches and your impressions as the curator for so many years with it?
The drawings were preserved. Can you hear me? A little closer. I'll try again. The drawings were preserved by the various successor firm, which went under various names as the partners changed over the years, until 1942, when one of the leading partners was Henry Richardson Shepley, Richardson's grandson. And I think it was he who primarily decided that it was time to safeguard Richardson's inheritance by placing it at Harvard. because of Richardson's own connection at Harvard, the connection of many of his clients with Harvard, and many of the successive members of the firm were also educated at Harvard. So, as Jay mentioned, Harvard had just opened a new state-of-the-art rare book library, and so in 1942, the surviving collection of drawings was donated by the firm to Harvard. Now, the Houghton building was fortunately finished before Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So the building was available. The drawings were transferred. They didn't get a lot of attention for some time, understandably not in the 40s. We know of a few instances where scholars asked to look at them during the 50s. There was enough demand for them that in the 60s, the library hired a man named Charles Price, who was then a graduate student in art history at Yale, to come and organize the collection and provide a basic catalog of the drawings. And it is to him that we owe the basic finding aid which we have now. He organized them by building project. He assigned the identifying numbers to individual drawings, which are still the references for locating those drawings. In 1974, which was the 50th anniversary of Richardson's move from New York to Brookline, the university had a limited exhibition of Richardson drawings curated by Jim O'Gorman, the great Richardson scholar of our century, who is still active at 90-something, and very kindly contributed an introduction to our book. That was shown at the Bogart Museum, I think at a museum in Albany and at the Renwick Gallery in New York City. Previously, in 1936, Henry Russell Hitchcock, then known as a very distinguished art historian, had curated an exhibition of a selection of drawings and photographs from the firm at MoMA in New York, and published a book to go with it. So, and Louis Mumford also praised Richardson when he wrote The Brown Decades. So there was a revival of interest in this material. More scholars got access to it, but there were problems of dealing with the drawings, finding the drawings, handling the drawings, reshelving the drawings. In the 1990s, the National Endowment for the Humanities gave a grant to the library for cataloging and conservation. And it was the microfilms that were made then that saved us during the COVID shutdown. And when I became curator of printing and graphic arts, which is a large collection of illustrated books and manuscripts and other things relating to the book arts, it was one of the most pleasant surprises was to find that I was responsible for the Richardson drawings. And over the years, we entertained a number of scholars who were publishing articles mostly on individual projects. So that was the origin of my familiarity with the collection, and I was very happy to become involved in this book project. I will add one footnote. In addition to the drawings, which the firm gave in 1942, they also gave Richardson's architectural library to Harvard and his 53 albums of study photographs. And those collections are preserved in the Special Collections Department at the Library School of Design at Harvard.
Thank you. And Mr. Milford, as a practitioner in historic preservation and restoration, a word perhaps about your journey of discovery with Richardson?
Well, I want to start by saying that I love the fact that Hope thinks in footnotes. My education at Cornell was based on architectural history as a basis for understanding design and understanding precedent. And so it was a natural transition over the course of my career to be able to move into historic preservation as part of my practice. You know, historic preservation is about two things. It's about cultural judgments, which seems like a good thing in this room, and practical values. And the room is a really good example of where the value of this space was taken to be so significant that it was disassembled and reassembled in this one location so that it could continue to serve and prosper as over the many years. You know, my deep involvement in historic preservation really came about 20 years ago. 40 years ago, I met Jay in my first architectural office, and we've been friends for all that time. About 20 years ago, he and I took a trip down Northeastern, where there are five Richardson buildings. And in the course of that trip, we found out that there was a development project that was going on that would substantially change the context of those buildings. It would have taken down the Ames Shovel Works in large measure, because the Ames Shovel Works is the core of that little village and the buildings surround it. So it really engaged me in the process of how do we create arguments for preserving these spaces, and how do we convince others who may not fully appreciate how important these buildings are to preserve them and restore them over time. It's not an easy thing to do. It's rarely a cheap thing to do. But it is incredibly valuable to our culture, and remembering that we have a long history. I just came back from a trip to Europe, and 200 years is nothing to them. This is still, these are all new buildings to them.
Well, before we give our wonderful speakers another round of applause, I just want to remind everyone that thanks to Mayor Sheehan, we will have a reception where you can speak to these extraordinary thinkers. And also, if you're interested, they have available copies of their book. Thank you, Mayor Sheehan. Most of all, Chief Judge Wilson, thank you for opening up Court of Appeals Hall to the City of Albany once again. Please join me in thanking our speakers.